All right, so let's get started. Some days my brain just doesn't keep up. 3 lectures of 116, all right, 312 stuff. And on the third lecture of 116, I was like, this is 312, right? And it wasn't, so I'm all over the place today. Just bear with me. We'll get through this. All right, 312, we're going to talk about HTML templating. So in homework 2, I already had it open, but in homework 2, I'm excited for this lecture too. I got a bunch of fun stuff to talk about. So in homework 2, in the first 2 objectives, you're implementing your form, you're receiving requests containing your files and your comments, and even just for learning objective 1, you have to be able to accept comments in this form, even if they don't contain images yet, because images, that's a whole new beast. That's for learning objective 2. So even if they don't contain images, you have to collect these comments, store them in your database, and then the thing that we want to talk about today, render them all on your page. How do we do that? That's the topic for today, HTML templates. So when you get comments uploaded, a bunch of users upload comments to your page, and they need to be rendered to your HTML. But for your HTML right now, you're reading an HTML file and shipping it over the internet. Where in that process are we going to get these comments added to the HTML? How do we do that? Is what we're going to talk about today. Right here. With demos, yay. So it's only 11 slides, and we're going to do some demos and see some stuff in action. Yeah.
For homework 2, are we supposed to be building off of homework 1, or should we read out?
Yes. Yeah, I get this question a lot too. I must not have made that clear. So for homework 2, for all 4 homeworks, the intent is that you're building one server with all of the functionality from all 4 homework assignments. So you should just continue building upon your server from homework 1. That said, we're not going to retest any homework 1 functionality. Some students do like to clean it up, get rid of the hi and hello stuff, and just build what they need for each homework. You're welcome to do that, or you're welcome to just leave them there and keep building upon it each time. But that's the goal. Build one server with all the functionality from all 4 homeworks. Yeah.
Just building up on his question, so the HTML file as well, we don't really necessarily change it, and additionally to know his added onto the existing one?
So a little bit different on that one. So the question, for the sample site, do we just keep sticking with that same sample site? So you can always change the front end. In each homework, I say you have full control over this. You can modify the front end if you want. If you want to style it and make it your own, you're welcome to do that as long as you still meet the requirements of the homework objective. But the intent is just to keep building on what you have from homework 1. So you'll still use the intended strategy is you still use the HTML, index.html from the sample site, but you take this code, you copy it, and you paste it into that index.html. That's the intent for this one. So you would still have like a flamingo there if you haven't changed it, but then you'd also have this form there. And same with the JavaScript. If you want to expand that JavaScript, for this homework, I don't think it's helpful, not until application objective 3, to modify that. But you will modify the JavaScript as well, and just keep modifying and adding to get the functionality that you want. Is there a question in there? Why is my phone off? It's not off, it's just locked. Did I really not touch it at all? Yeah, the last lecture didn't really ask any questions. How should comments be stored in the database? Would it be similar to JSON object from homework 1, like so? That's a different question. It's up to you. However you want to store it. There are details about how your server works that aren't defined in the homework document. When it comes to things that aren't defined, like how to get things done, it's up to you. Your programmers, your developers, in not too long, a matter of a year or 2, you're going to be out there in the real world writing software. And nobody's going to hold your hand and say, store that as a JSON object or a JSON string. No, you just get stuff done. However you want to approach that problem and solve that problem, store it however you want. JSON string is fine if you're using Mongo, but if you're using MySQL, probably not a JSON string. You're going to store it in separate separate columns of a table. But however you want. You know enough about computer science at this point that you can decide that for yourself. JSON and a MongoDB would be fine, though. Should we have received confirmation that our group is all set up for the 312 project? No. If you want to email me, I can send you and confirm. Anybody who's not on a team got confirmation from me. I sent an email that said, here's your team. If you didn't get one of those emails, then you're on the team that you submitted. If you want to confirm to make sure that that team is the one that you actually got, send me an email. I'll send you a list of your teammates. You can confirm whether that's accurate or not. Nobody got a submission on 2 different teams, and anybody who wasn't on any team got the random team. So I don't see any issues, but again, just let me know. I'll confirm. By default, I'm not sending out confirmation. And meetings start this week. Maybe I should talk about this in lecture a little bit. Just remind y'all. Meetings start this week. So this team meeting form, each time you meet, or as often as you'd like, you can submit this more often. If you didn't have a meeting, but a teammate did something that upset you, you can fill out the form and let me know, and just keep me informed. Then they do something, they commit some code, and you're all better now. Submit it again and say, never mind, we cool again. Let me know what's going on. These don't directly, for every meeting, every week, I want ratings of each team member of how you're satisfied or not satisfied with their performance. That doesn't directly affect their grade. That's just information that I use, and then at the end of the semester, after projects are all graded, during finals week or sometimes even after finals week, I'll look at all of the data for the whole semester and decide if I need to make any individual grade adjustments. I'll use these forms, I'll use the commits in the GitHub repo and look at what code they actually contributed. I'll look at any information available to me to make those decisions. Usually, this is just my first indicator. If somebody's getting a lot of low scores, especially if they're getting low scores at the end of the semester, I weigh that a lot more than low scores at the beginning of the semester. But if a teammate's getting low scores at the end of the semester, I take that as an indication that there's a problem, and then I dig deeper to find out if there actually was a problem that I can confirm. And if I can confirm it, then they're getting a lower grade than the rest of the team. So let me know through this form. If you're happy with all your teammates, give them straight 10s like a lot of teams do and say everything was good. I get a lot of that, just straight 10s, everything's great, and the team ends up getting almost a 0 on the project, and I look through the repo and only like 2 people committed. There was clearly an issue here, but if you're not gonna let me know anything, I don't know. Sometimes I still make an adjustment, but anyway, start filling those out, start meeting, start talking about the project, and let me know if there are questions about it. So, HTML templates. This is what we want to talk about today. We got this problem that I just mentioned. We want to serve more dynamic HTML. We don't want to just say, here's my HTML file, here it is, that's my site. That's what I always call poster sites. It's just, here's the information, it is what it is. But now we have dynamic content that's generated by the users that needs to be rendered in your HTML. So how are we going to do this? How do we get all those messages to appear and eventually images to appear on that HTML page, on your home page, as users are submitting that form? How do we do that? And the answer is HTML templates. So what is an HTML template? It's a partial HTML file. Instead of writing all of your HTML in the file, you're only going to write parts of it, and then use placeholders for other parts where there will eventually be data. And we'll see that this is another way of separating our concerns. The HTML, I said, should be worried about structure. Structure only. It really should just be worried about structure of your page, not your data. Data isn't part of structure. Hard-coding data into HTML is generally not the best thing to do. We want HTML to be worried about the structure and separate that from our data. So instead, we're going to put in placeholders where the actual data is going to go, and then we're going to render the templates, which means we're going to replace those placeholders with the actual data at runtime. We're going to do this at runtime, so when a request comes in, we're going to take the template, take the data, smash them together, and then send back the final HTML to the user each time we get a request. This is very dynamic, very flexible. This means we can send different HTML to each user. We can send different HTML as we gain more data, as people submit the form. Just gives us full flexibility over what we do. Let's see our first template. Now, you have a lot of freedom in how you do your HTML templating, and students have come up with lots of different solutions in the past. I'll show you one that uses the syntax of a HTML template engine called Bootstrap. I kind of like the syntax that it uses, and it is my template engine of choice when I'm not doing templating from scratch. In this course, you of course have to do it from scratch. But in the real world, you'll use a template engine, and I don't know, I just like Bootstrap, or not Bootstrap. I do also like Bootstrap, but I like handlebars. I don't know why, but I like this syntax. So in that syntax, the placeholders are double braces, which happens to be a character that is very rarely ever showing up in your HTML itself. And now that kind of handlebars took that syntax and claimed it, just don't use double braces in your HTML itself for any reason. And then you'll avoid any issues with handlebars, with your templating engine. So we're going to use double braces as our placeholders. So this is a placeholder that's going to store a variable named title, placeholder for description, and a placeholder for the file name of an image, which is something we'll have to do starting in Learning Objective 2. So we have an image, which its source is going to be equal to some placeholder that will replace at runtime when we get an HTTP request for our HTML. We're going to replace that with just the file name and then send it off to the user. The user is going to make another request for the file, and then we're going to respond to that request as well. Some students, I don't know why, but I don't know if it's easier, if it's even cheese, but some students like to jam all of the content of the file right here, base64 encoded. I don't know why y'all do that, but some students do that. It's a lot easier just to do the file name. And it's what's expected. You get a request, you read your HTML template into your code. HTML, an HTML file is just text. Just text. So we can read it as binary, we can read it in bytes, and then convert that into text, or we just read it as text. But at the end of the day, it's just text. When you send your HTTP responses with HTML, the HTML is just text that you convert into bytes and slam at the end of your response, then send it over the internet. It's just text. So when you read this file, you're going to use any string manipulation code that you're capable of writing, which you're all very capable of writing since 1.15. Mainly a find and replace. Simplest thing to do is just find and replace. So read your HTML as a string, dot replace, brace, brace, title, brace, brace, with whatever your actual title is for the page that you're rendering. So you're going to do that, replace your placeholders with the actual values of the data, and then the final string that you have, which is your HTML, your final HTML that we say is rendered from the template, we're going to send that off to the user. So we use placeholders in our HTML template, render it when we get a request, and then send the final HTML, the rendered HTML, to the user. Simple enough, right? Conceptually, at least, this is pretty simple. Insofar, even in the code, it's not too bad, not too difficult. But there's more functionality that we would want. Specifically for homework 2, we want some idea of a loop. This is a place where a lot of y'all cheese it and just do one placeholder and says this is where all the stuff goes. But which, it is what it is. But to be more robust, and more specifically when you get out of this course and you're actually using a template engine, It's going to have syntax like this. This is the syntax for Bootstrap. I keep saying Bootstrap, handlebars specifically. But we'll have some markers to indicate the start and end of a loop. So I'm going to say my loop starts here and ends here. And everything inside of the loop is going to be rendered for each element of some data structure. And that data structure is going to have these values for any placeholders that are inside of this loop. So in Python, I might have a list, and that list will have a bunch of values. I'm going to loop through this HTML and render this HTML, which is just an H6 element, and render that for each element of the data structure. This way, we can have HTML in here. This might be fairly complex HTML. I might be building a table, and this will be creating multiple rows, or a row with multiple columns to separate the data. It might be, whatever we want it to be. There might be a lot of styling involved. So this lets us write our HTML in here and then iterate that for each element of a data structure. Those of you who will just do one big placeholder for the stuff, it gets you through homework 2, I suppose. The problem is, don't do that professionally. Don't do that in your career, please. When you're using template engines, use this. And the big reason for that is if you do have one big placeholder, you're going to end up with HTML hard-coded into your Python or whatever language you're using. You're going to have HTML hard-coded into your code, into your server code, which is just horrible practice. Your HTML file should store all the structure of your code. If you have one big placeholder, you're putting some of the structure of your code into your server code, or structure of your page into your server code. Not good. So just be aware, even if you're going to cheese it this semester, which I've kind of accepted, even if you're going to cheese it, do at least learn the lesson of why that's bad, that you don't have separation of concerns anymore. So you're going to iterate over your data, and whatever's in between the loop tags, render that using the same placeholder, find and replace that you did for the entire page, and render it for each piece of data in the data structure. It's also common to have conditionals, or say if some value, have a conditional right in our HTML, render this HTML, otherwise render this HTML. Yeah. Yes. So the example that I just showed, you would be limited to one loop per page. It is just a weakness of that example. If you want multiple loops per page, then you would have some way, like you're saying, to identify each one. I don't have much to say about the conditional, so we can... you do have to evaluate this conditional some way, so choosing how to evaluate that conditional, I was going to say it gets tricky, but it's not that tricky. You just have to have some way to evaluate that in your code. How to say, if something, how do you evaluate this? Okay, another reminder on this one, but when you're rendering your homework 2 templates, you're going to have an image in your loop. You're going to loop over some HTML and add an image, a caption and an image each time you iterate over that loop. Don't overthink the images. I feel like I say this with images all the time, but don't overthink your images. Just put the file name as the source of the image tag and send it. That's it. The user is going to get that response with the HTML with all these dynamically added image 1, image 2, image 3, whatever you named your images, and then it's going to make a request for each of those images afterwards. Those requests are going to hit your /images path, and then you're going to host those images as separate HTTP responses. I don't know why, but once we hit this point, students kind of forget the idea of a single request returns a single thing. one request, one response, and the browser's going to send a whole mess of requests. You're going to send a mess of responses, and the browser puts it all together and renders it as a full page. It's the same thing here when we're using templates. I don't know why, but students start trying to insert all of the image data into these things, starting with homework 2, but not for the Flamingo and homework 1. Don't do that. Just put the file names as the source of an image, and then wait for more requests to come in. They'll come in, the browser's going to see that, and then make requests for the images and respond with those images. So as long as you have your images path, your HTML path that renders the template, you're going to get all the images rendered on your HTML. And again, you don't have to use the syntax that I use there. You don't have to use the double braces. You're free to do whatever you want for your templates, as long as the user's getting fully rendered HTML, or something I won't talk about this fully until next week, next Wednesday, I believe, or you can host an API that sends raw data and then have JavaScript on your front end render that content, render into HTML, and then display it on the page. If you're doing application objective 3, that's the expected strat, the intended strat for that one. Though I've already talked to a student and they found a different way to do it, which I'm fine with, is rendering it server-side anyway. But if you want to set up an API that hosts your data and then render HTML on the front end, you're welcome to do that as well, which is more common in practice. We usually just host raw data with APIs and then let the user's CPU do all the crunching and generating the HTML. Very common for a lot of reasons. Not least of which is faster page loads. You notice how, since I kind of started this tangent, let's go down this road a little bit. You notice pretty much every time you go to any page ever these days, the page loads like immediately, but with no content. It just loads up, and then you get a bunch of like empty boxes everywhere, and then they slowly start populating. That's because the HTML is just the template that they're sending you, and the template, they're just reading a file and sending the HTML. That happens really fast. And then they have JavaScript. You get the JavaScript as well that's included, and then run the JavaScript, and the JavaScript makes a whole bunch of what's called AJAX calls, which we'll talk about also next Wednesday, right? Make a bunch of AJAX calls to the server, responds with just data, usually as JSON strings, and then the JavaScript on the front end renders all those responses, renders all that stuff, and then starts populating your HTML with all the actual content. So it's a fast page load, and then it takes a while to get the data and get the HTML template rendered on your front end. That's very common. Every time you see that on pretty much any page ever, that's what's happening. So that's what we will eventually talk about next week. Next week or in 2 weeks? What day is it? Monday? Next week. Next week we'll talk about that. Who's ready for examples? Anybody got questions on this, by the way? This is a topic I don't have a ton to talk about with it, a ton to say. And then most of the difficulty is just getting it to work in your code. Which I don't think is too hard, but students struggle with it, with the templates. Not terribly so, but okay. I'm going to very carefully open this repo. Okay, here's some HTML that I have for this page. Actually, let's shut it down. Get it running so I could test, and we can shut it down and show the whole process. Is homework 2 related to API use from homework 1? No, unfortunately I don't. There was the full intent to do that, but I kind of have you do the API for homework 1, and then we don't revisit it. We might revisit it in homework 4 this semester, but right now we don't. Not in homework 2, at least. So here's my HTML for the server. This is a server with all kinds of functionality that I'm going to very carefully click around, because whenever I show code in lecture, people blindly copy it into their code. I mentioned this last time. I don't want to rant again, but blindly copy it into their code and then come to office hours with, show me my own code and say, why doesn't it work? And I say, it's because you don't understand anything. You just blindly pasted the code. If you are going to just blindly take code like that, take the time to understand what the hell it does. It drives me nuts when people just take my code and have no understanding. And usually because they have to type it character for character, usually they have one typo and they can't comprehend what happened wrong. It's because they have no idea what the understanding of the code. So I'm very careful to not show much code in this class. I'm sorry for the rest of you who would actually benefit from that. But too many people are hurt by that. That I try to not show much code these days. But here's my HTML. You can see that I have my placeholders here. I have a placeholder for image name, image file name. So here's the thing. Here's the image. It's an image name. And I'm going to replace, here I'm using the same placeholder name 2 different times. And the way, I'm not going to show the code, but the way I have this working is I have a Python dictionary on the other end in my code that I'll get. And that dictionary will have keys with any of the placeholder names that I'm looking for. And then I'm going to replace the key, any name with the key, I'm going to put my double braces around it, and then do a find and replace with the value at that key in the Python dictionary. Yes, students would copy that code and not understand it. I thought it was straightforward, but it's not. To be fair, it gets a little more complicated when the loop comes into play, but not that much so. And then the loop down here, I have a loop, start loop, and end loop. Again, I can only have one loop the way I have this set up. And I have a little bit of HTML to render a user's message, their name in bold, their message italicized, and then a new line. So I'm going to render this HTML once for each value in a data structure. So I have a data structure, an array specifically of objects, and that's stored at a key for loop data or whatever you want to choose if you want to follow the same structure. A key that says this is the data that's going to be rendered in the loop. And that value is an array, and I'm going to iterate over the array. Specifically, I'm going to have an array of dictionaries, and then each dictionary is going to have username and message as separate keys. And I'm going to render those the same way I rendered the entire HTML. I'm going to render those, but for each of them, I'm going to render this HTML, but just by calling the first method that I write to be able to render it. So I'm not going to show the code, but that's an overview of exactly what it does and how it does it. So I'm going to iterate that, render that for each element of my data structure. And of course, this is where you would store your messages in a database, read from the database, then render the loop, get all the loop data in there. And let's see this in action. So I'm going to start this up, Docker Compose up. I like to always do build and force recreate. I've been bit enough times by doing Docker Compose up and forgetting that I actually did change some code. So I just force recreate every single time. I'm going to run this thing. Need homework 2 up anymore. And we can see the page. So I have that number of visits with the placeholder. Should I do this side by side? So I have visit number and then a placeholder for visits. I got 0 because this is my first time visiting the page. I replaced my image name, image file name. And with the, come on, oh, you piece of crap. And with the image file name, I'm just putting literally the image file name, image/eagle.jpg. That's all that goes right here. That's all that goes right there. And then the browser's going to make another request for that actual image. And this HTML is actually what was responded, what we responded with. So let's go to the network tab. Usually when you go to the network tab, there's nothing there. You got to refresh the page to get all the requests. If I look at the HTML that was sent, I don't even get to see that it was a template. The user, when you do server-side HTML templating, the user doesn't even see that this was a template. It doesn't see that there used to be a placeholder here because the values were already replaced before the response was sent to the user. I can see my alt text. I can't see my alt text. Oh well. And if we go all the way down, I can see my loop, which isn't anything. If you don't go loop any data, it doesn't run even once, right? So let's add a comment. And I can see each time I send a new comment, it's going to render this code for each comment. So if we go back to our network tab, refresh. That HTML is going to be rendered for each value in my data structure. So I'm getting that HTML for each comment that was made in this case. That's what my template engine's doing. It's storing username and message, and then iterating over all the messages and rendering that HTML for each one, which is very much what you have to do in homework 2. It would be better to have JavaScript running in the browser doing the replacement rather than replacing the HTML before we send it. It's generally, so there's a lot of trade-offs here. Generally better, it's hard to say better, but generally what's chosen is JavaScript on the front end. So a few trade-offs. One, page loads that I mentioned. The page is going to load slower if you have to render everything and then just send the final content to the user, as opposed to sending it right away and then having stuff slowly populate. That has a huge psychological effect. If the page takes too long to load, even though you get everything, like the page is done loading at the same time, roughly. There's a huge psychological effect if you click a link and you don't see anything for a bit. It can be frustrating. You can lose a lot of users that way. If there's at least something right away, you're convinced that the page is doing something, and then you're more likely to wait around for it. 2, whose CPU are you using? I kind of mentioned this just a little bit ago, but whose CPU are you using? If you're rendering templates server-side, it's your CPU. If you're rendering client-side, it's your client CPU. So the client running their CPU, they probably won't notice that much. It's not that big of a deal. But if you have millions of concurrent users, you're a huge site, that adds up. That's a lot of processing power that your servers then have to do. And it's harder to index things if you're generating the HTML every single time. There's just a lot of downsides to it. I'll give a third one here. If you just have an API that's hosting raw data instead of rendering HTML and sending HTML, it makes it easier to run your app on something that doesn't run HTML. So you want to do a native mobile app, you just write the front end for your app, just the structure, the styling, and everything, and then you hit those same API endpoints, get the raw data, and then render it client-side. You don't have to rewrite your entire server to write a new app for another platform. You just hit the API. Everything's going to speak HTTP, so you hit the HTTP endpoints, get JSON strings. Everything can speak strings. You parse it, get a JSON parsing library. Very versatile to be able to expand into other areas. And these days, it seems like you have to have an Android app, an iOS app, a web app, sometimes a desktop app. You got to have a lot of different architectures that you support if you're going to be a big major app. People expect a lot these days, so if you host an API with raw data, generally a lot easier to do that. So a lot of benefits to doing it client-side. Any questions on this? I think that's all I want to show for HTML templates. Just show you it in action. Okay, there's something I talked about. If there are no questions on HTML templates, I'm done talking about them. I just don't have much else to say about them. Some I got to cover because I'll get a bunch of questions. But if there are no questions, I'm done. How are you replacing the placeholders? I don't know. You can show this or not. I'll explain it. I'm fine explaining how the code works, but I won't show the code. I have in past semesters and caused nothing but issues. So sick of seeing my own code with somebody mistyping it and saying, "Why don't it work?" Because I showed you that as an example for you to understand how it works. So now I just explained to you how it works, so you have to understand the code that you're submitting for credit to show that you understand computer science. But I'm happy to explain it. I briefly explained it, but I'll go into a little more detail here. So you read the HTML from the file as a string, and then I'm using string manipulation, mostly just replace. If I store my HTML in a string called S1, I don't know, I wouldn't call it that, but S1, I'll do S1.replace, just literally the Python string replace method. And then whatever my placeholder value is, whatever I have in my HTML, and then I'll replace it with the actual value that I'm using in Python. So I wrote this to be nice and generic. I can use it for a lot of different purposes, where it'll take a Python dictionary with all the values that I want to replace, and the keys will be the names of the placeholders, and the values will be, I'm backwards. I always do things backwards in lecture. The keys will be the placeholder names, and the values will be the actual values that I need to replace those with. I'll iterate over the dictionary, take the key, concatenate my double braces on either side of it. I usually do a dot strip on it too to make sure I don't have any white space issues. Be very careful in your HTML to not have any white space or address that one way or another. And then I'll take my HTML, my big S1, and do dot replace the concatenated string with the braces to have the placeholder name. And then the second argument would be whatever the value is in that Python dictionary for that specific key. And then I have to be very careful. One of the mistakes a lot of students make when they just stole my code, not stole, I gave it to them, but when they use my code is you have to make sure that the placeholders in the HTML exactly match the names of the keys in your Python code, because that's literally what it's looking for. It's taking that key in the dictionary, add in the braces, and looking for that exact string in your HTML. So if you have like open brace, space, and then your placeholder variable name, it's not going to work. It doesn't work like that. If you're setting it up like this, you're free to set it up however you want. But if that's what you're doing, it's not going to work if you have an extra space or any, it's not the most robust code, so it's easy to break it. And then, so that's all the placeholders. You give it a dictionary, all the values. I can show one side of this, actually. So when I'm ready to render my template, I give it the name of my template. I'm going to open that file, and then I'm going to give it all the data that it's going to replace. So I have a placeholder called image name. So my code's going to slap the braces on both ends of this, and then do a replace with whatever I read from this file, replace the placeholder with the value. Same thing with image file name. I'm going to have some extra logic to skip over loop data. And then visits. Oh, I didn't show off visits. Not really going to explain it anyway, but yay, visits goes up. And then visits, I'm going to send that visits. And then loop data is a special key, the way I have this set up, where I'm going to look for the loop open and close tags, take everything that's in between those two tags, and then render that for each value in the loop data. Chat history is going to be an array, a list that looks like this. It's a list of dictionaries. And then for each of those dictionaries, I'm going to call my code that I just explained. I'm going to call that, pretending that just the loop data, whatever's between the two loop tags, I'm going to pretend that's my HTML template. And I'm going to say render it with this dictionary. and then it spits back some rendered HTML, and I just keep concatenating that onto my final answer, onto my final HTML. So I'm using loop data as a special keyword, basically. That makes sense? I sent a 302 redirect. Yeah, that's fine. If you send a 302, and I would expect it to request all the files. We don't do indexing, we don't do any indexing, and that's not the right word, is it? Caching. We don't do any caching in this class. So what you would do is cache those, tell the browser to cache those files, and then it wouldn't request them again. We don't do that, so I would expect it to request each one of the files on the redirect. You're literally reloading the entire page from scratch. Visits goes stocks. To summarize, the HTML holds placeholders that the JavaScript code replaces with data in our Python code. Whoa. The JavaScript code replaces with data in our Python code. I don't know where you get the JavaScript from in there. No, this is all in Python. So the Python reads your HTML and then replaces the placeholders with these values. JavaScript isn't involved here. JavaScript is because I was mentioning two different things, maybe that's where the confusion comes from. I would expect you to do everything in Python, assuming you're using Python for your homework, whatever you're using for your homework code. An alternative solution, which I wouldn't expect you to do until you're doing application objective 3, you would have to think about this. Then in the front-end JavaScript, you would get that JavaScript involved and have it do some of the rendering. But for everything you need to get up to application objective 3, it would all be in Python or your language of choice. Okay, good questions. Any other questions? Okay, so I have this path. In short, this is looking for a path that starts with /image. It's going to take everything after the second slash as the file name, open a file with that name, and send it to the user. Right? And of course, this is the punchline that I'm going to talk about replacing the slashes. We talked about the security vulnerability of somebody can request arbitrary files on your server if you have a path like this and you're not careful. So what's the actual threat of this? Well, if we go to the page, we're going to type, I know it's hard to see this one, but /image, I actually forgot my path name. Image, not images. I always forget if I put image or images. Image / and I'm going to try, just as a proof of concept, I'm going to try to access the server code in server.py. So I know, just knowing the directory structure, an actual attacker would have to take a bunch of guesses and try to root around a little bit. I know where it is. It's going to be up 2 directories. I'll actually show you. So my images are in this directory. I'm going to read it from public image. So if I go up a directory, I'll be in public. If I go up another directory, I'll be in the root directory of the project. And then I'm going to go to server.py. That'll be a proof of concept that I can access any file on my hard drive. An attacker can access any single file. So what I'm going to do is navigate. I'm going to use ... which means go up one directory, /... /server.py. Content not found. So if I go to the network tab and refresh that, oops, it already did it up here too. ... /... If I look at the request that was actually made, the browser got rid of my ... /... and it said, oh, you just want server.py. So we're secure, right? Browser's got our back. Browser's not going to let people navigate. I'm pretty sure, forgot to test this right before lecture, that it'll get rid of the tildes too. Oh, no, it didn't get rid of the tilde. Okay. So you can still go to the, tilde is home directory, so that'll go to the home directory of my machine, and then start navigating from there. So we could still do that too. So we're still not safe. But you know what doesn't do that is Postman. You know who gets to use Postman? Anyone, including attackers. So Postman, if somebody can fire off an attack with Postman, an attacker can actually fire off that attack. So let's do the same thing here. http://localhost 8080/./server.py send. Content not found. Wait, hold on. That was supposed to happen. What is it? Oh, yeah, thank you. Image slash. Yeah, there we go. Now I got my image path. It doesn't render, and if I look at the headers, content type, I've hard-coded as image.jpg. I should also have my no sniff, so the response wouldn't be rendered, but the data will still be sent. The bytes will still be sent. It just won't be rendered on the page. That's why it's not even attempting to render this object, which I don't know why I don't have a button for show me the raw stuff, but you can save the response. Response.jpg, I'll change this to response.txt. It's going to ask me to overwrite because I already did this. I save that, I can open it, and there's my server code. I send a request, an attacker could send a request, get my server code, they can access any arbitrary file on my hard drive just by navigating the directory structure. As long as my server has permission to, there is one caveat. My server, whatever user my server is running under has to have permission to access the file, I suppose. And you can see my server code, which is code I'm fine showing you because you have no chance of being able to use this without the rest of the context. By the way, just a foreshadow, but my handle method isn't that long. I would expect most of your handle methods to be ridiculously long right now with a big if, elif, elif, elif. I recommend not doing that, but I haven't showed you a better way, so I